Rain hammered the chapel steps like bullets against stone. Daniel Warren stood beneath the narrow overhang, watching the last mourners scatter into the gray afternoon. His collar was damp. His hands shook. Across the street, half hidden beneath a black umbrella, she stood perfectly still. Elena, the woman whose name had just been carved into granite. The woman who had been declared dead 3 weeks ago. Their eyes met through the rain. She didn't move, didn't breathe. The umbrella cast her face in shadow, but he knew that silhouette. The way she held her shoulders, the tilt of her head when she was deciding whether to run. Daniel stepped forward. His foot hit the first step, then the second. Water streamed down his face. The umbrella tilted. She turned. By the time he reached the street, she was gone. Puddles remained, reflecting the bruised sky above. The mourners had vanished into their cars. The chapel doors stood closed behind him. Daniel's chest tightened. He stood in the middle of the empty street, rain soaking through his jacket. His mind struggled to process what he'd seen, the impossible collision of funeral and vision, of death and breathing flesh. The casket had been real, though closed throughout the service. The dirt on his hands from the graveside was real. The preacher's words about eternal rest had echoed off chapel walls with granite certainty. But the woman across the street had been real too. Elena was supposed to be 6 feet underground, not standing in the rain with her familiar way of watching the world like she was always about to disappear from it. The funeral had happened. Elena Grey was dead, but so was the woman who had looked at him through the storm before melting back into the city's gray embrace. The funeral notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped between utility bills and grocery store flyers. Daniel Warren almost threw it away with the rest of the mail. Elena Grey, 34, passed peacefully on October 15th. Memorial service Friday, 2 p.m., Sacred Heart Chapel. He stared at the paper until the words blurred. Elena Grey. 6 years since they'd spoken. 6 years since she'd walked out of his apartment with nothing but a canvas bag and a look he'd never forgotten. Equal parts apology and determination, like she was saving him from something he couldn't see. The coffee in his mug had gone cold. Outside his kitchen window, the city stretched gray and endless, apartment blocks rising like tombstones against the overcast sky. He worked in IT for a logistics firm downtown, debugging systems that moved cargo he never saw to places he'd never been. His life had become a series of quiet routines, days dissolving into each other like sugar in rain. But Elena was supposed to be somewhere else, living her life, making her mistakes, not dead at 34. He pulled out his phone and searched her name. Nothing recent. Her social media accounts had gone dark months ago. Her last post was a blurry photo of a coffee shop window, rain streaking the glass. No caption, no likes, no comments. Daniel folded the notice and slipped it into his wallet next to his credit cards and a driver's license photo that made him look like a stranger. At work, he sat in his gray cubicle and pretended to fix database errors while images of Elena cycled through his mind. The way she laughed at her own jokes, the way she counted money twice before spending it, the way she'd look at him sometimes, like she was seeing through him to something he couldn't understand. She'd been broke when they met, broke when they dated, broke when she left. Bills piling up faster than she could pay them, credit cards maxed out, rent 3 months behind. She'd talked about getting a fresh start, about disappearing somewhere new where nobody knew her name. He'd offered to help. She'd refused, said she needed to figure it out herself. At the time, he'd respected her independence, though guilt had gnawed at him for years afterward. The feeling that his caution had abandoned her when she needed support most. He'd convinced himself she wanted space, that pushing would only drive her further away. Now she was dead, and he was still debugging other people's mistakes in a windowless office, eating lunch alone at his desk. The funeral notice felt heavy in his wallet, like a stone he couldn't put down. Something about her leaving had felt unfinished then, and her dying felt unfinished now. 6 years of silence, and the only thing that had brought them back together was a casket and a handful of strangers pretending to mourn. Elena had deserved better than that. She had deserved someone who knew her real laugh, her real fears, her real dreams about starting over. Maybe that someone should have been him. Sacred Heart Chapel sat wedged between a dry cleaner and a tax preparation office, its brick facade stained with decades of exhaust and rain. Daniel arrived early, parking across the street where he could watch the entrance without being seen. The mourners trickled in slowly, A handful of middle-aged women in black coats, an elderly man with a walker, a younger couple who looked uncomfortable, checking their phones every few minutes. Daniel counted 12 people total. For Elena, who could light up a room just by walking into it, who knew every bartender in 3 neighborhoods, who collected friends like some people collected coins. But maybe that was the Elena from before. The Elena who disappeared 6 years ago had been different. Quieter, more cautious, pulling away from people like she was afraid of contaminating them with her problems. She'd stopped going to parties, stopped answering calls from old friends. By the time she'd left, her world had already shrunk to the size of her debts. He slipped inside as the service began and took a seat in the back row. The chapel smelled of old wood and wilted flowers. The casket was closed, polished mahogany covered with white lilies that looked too perfect, too fresh. The minister spoke about eternal rest and God's grace, but his words felt hollow, rehearsed. He stumbled over Elena's name twice, calling her our departed sister instead. No one shared memories. No one wept. The whole service lasted 23 minutes. Daniel studied the faces around him. None looked familiar. None looked like they'd actually known Elena Grey. The middle-aged women whispered to each other during the prayers. The elderly man dozed off. The young couple left before the final hymn. The eerie atmosphere was heightened by the realization that the 12 mourners seemed as disconnected from each other as they were from Elena. They avoided eye contact, sat in scattered isolation, as if they were all strangers brought together by some invisible thread that none could identify. As the service ended, he followed the small procession to the cemetery 6 blocks away. The grave was already dug, a neat rectangle of dark earth beside other headstones. The groundskeeper operated a small crane to lower the casket, his movements practiced and efficient. Each mourner scattered a handful of dirt. The sound was wrong somehow, too soft, too easy. Daniel waited until the others had gone, then approached the grave. The headstone was simple granite, the inscription fresh. Elena Grey, 1989 to 2023, beloved daughter. He knelt and placed his hand on the cold stone. The dates were right, the name was right, but something felt off, like a photograph that had been retouched too many times. The sky darkened, thunder rumbled in the distance, then came the rain, and then, across the street, came the woman with the black umbrella. Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to his upstairs neighbor's television bleeding through the walls. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face beneath that black umbrella. By morning, he'd convinced himself it was grief playing tricks, stress, too much coffee and not enough sleep. People saw what they needed to see, but he went back to the cemetery anyway. The morning sun cast long shadows across the headstones, and in the clear light, details emerged that the rain had obscured. During the service, a canvas canopy had covered the gravesite, blocking his view of the inscription. The rain afterward had made everything blur together in his memory. Daniel approached Elena's grave slowly, remembering how she used to correct people's spelling with the patience of a kindergarten teacher. She'd been meticulous about names, about getting things right. She would have hated having her name misspelled on a restaurant reservation, let alone on her own headstone. He knelt and traced the inscription with his finger. Elena Grey, 1989 to 2023, beloved daughter. Not Elena Grey, Elena Grey. Daniel sat back on his heels. The spelling was wrong, the name was wrong, but the dates matched, the location matched. The funeral had been real. A groundskeeper approached, pushing a wheelbarrow full of wilted flowers. He was older, weathered, with dirt permanently embedded under his fingernails. The man studied Daniel with pale blue eyes and asked if he'd known the girl. When Daniel said he thought he had, the groundskeeper explained that it was unusual. Most young deaths brought more visitors, but this one had only attracted Daniel. Daniel asked about family and friends. The groundskeeper shrugged and told him about a woman who had paid for the burial in cash. No next of kin, she'd said. Just wanted a decent funeral for someone who deserved better. The woman had looked similar to the deceased. Same dark hair, same build. She'd appeared 3 days ago, right after the service. When Daniel asked when exactly this had happened, the groundskeeper's eyes narrowed. He observed that Daniel looked like he'd seen a ghost. Daniel stood and brushed dirt from his knees. The inscription stared back at him from the stone. Elena Grey. Not Elena Grey, but the woman at the funeral had been Elena. He was sure of it. The way she moved, The way she stood, the way she'd looked at him across the street before disappearing into the rain. He walked back to his car, his mind racing. Either Elena had changed her name and faked her death, or someone else had died in her place. Either way, the woman in the casket wasn't the woman he'd loved. The woman he'd loved was still out there, somewhere, hiding behind a black umbrella and a misspelled name. Elena's last known address was a brick complex on the east side, the kind of place where people minded their own business and nobody asked questions. Daniel had driven by it countless times over the years, never stopping, never looking too long. Now he stood in the lobby, studying the row of mailboxes. No Elena Grey, no Elena Grey, just empty slots and peeling labels. The building manager was a thin woman with suspicious eyes and a ring of keys that jangled when she walked. She emerged from a ground-floor apartment, wiping her hands on a stained apron. When Daniel asked about Elena Grey, the woman claimed she didn't know anyone by that name. Daniel mentioned apartment 3B, saying Elena would have moved out recently. The manager told him 3B had been empty for 2 months after the last tenant skipped out on rent. She asked if he was a debt collector. Daniel said he was a friend. The woman's expression softened slightly, not with sympathy, but with something closer to pity. "Friends usually visit while people are alive," she said, then turned to go back inside. She mentioned the building had new management and didn't keep records on former tenants. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Daniel took the stairs to the 3rd floor. The hallway smelled of cigarettes and industrial cleaner. Apartment 3B sat at the end, its door unmarked and slightly ajar. The lock showed signs of recent tampering, fresh scratches around the mechanism, and a slight misalignment of the strike plate. He pushed it open. The apartment was stripped bare. No furniture, no belongings, just stained carpet and scuff marks on the walls where pictures had hung. The kitchen counters were empty except for a thin layer of dust. The bathroom medicine cabinet gaped open, its shelves barren, but the bedroom closet still held a few wire hangers and a single shoe, a black flat with a worn heel, Elena's size. Daniel picked up the shoe and turned it over. The leather was soft, familiar. He'd seen her wear these shoes to dinner, to work, to the grocery store. They were her everyday shoes, the ones she'd never leave behind. A sound from the hallway made him freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. He slipped the shoe into his jacket pocket and moved to the window. The fire escape was rusted, but functional. He climbed out and descended to the alley below, his heart hammering. Back on the street, he looked up at the building. In the 3rd floor window, a shadow moved behind the curtains. Someone was in Elena's apartment, someone who hadn't been there moments before. Daniel walked to his car, the shoe heavy in his pocket. Elena had lived in that apartment for 3 years. She'd painted the walls blue. She'd hung fairy lights around the window. She'd made it home, but she'd left without her favorite shoes, or someone had made sure she couldn't take them. The pawn shop sat 2 blocks from Elena's old apartment, its windows cluttered with guitars, jewelry, and electronic equipment. Daniel had driven past it a dozen times without really seeing it. Now he noticed the security cameras, the reinforced glass, the way the owner watched every customer like they might bolt. He'd been sitting in his car for 20 minutes, watching the entrance when she appeared. Same height, same building, same way of moving through the world, like she was always late for something important. She wore a gray coat with the collar turned up, her dark hair hidden beneath a knit cap. Elena. She paused at the pawn shop door, glanced over her shoulder with the quick, nervous gesture of someone who'd learned to check for shadows, then stepped inside. The urgency in her movements suggested desperation, the kind that made risky choices feel like the only choices. Daniel waited. His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. Through the shop window, he could see her talking to the owner, gesturing at something behind the counter. The conversation lasted 3 minutes. She left with a small paper bag. On the sidewalk, she looked directly at his car. For a moment, they stared at each other through the windshield. She was older, thinner, with new lines around her eyes. But it was Elena. Unmistakably Elena. She ran. The fear that drove her flight was so complete, so consuming, that any instinct to reach out to him was overwhelmed by the terror of being seen, of leading surveillance back to the person she'd sacrificed everything to protect. Her love for him was precisely what made contact impossible. Daniel fumbled with his seatbelt, pushed open the car door, and gave chase. But she was faster, more desperate. She turned the corner and vanished into the maze of alleys behind the commercial district. He searched for 20 minutes. Every doorway became a potential hiding place. Every footstep echoed with possibility, but the neighborhood had swallowed her whole. Back at the pawn shop, the owner was closing up. He was a heavy man with thick glasses and paint-stained fingers. He looked up as Daniel approached and said they were closed. Daniel asked about the woman who had just been there. The owner's expression hardened as he said he didn't discuss customer business. Daniel pulled out his wallet and set 2 20s on the counter, explaining he was her friend and worried about her. The money disappeared into the owner's pocket. He explained that she'd been selling electronics, phone, tablet, laptop, good quality items, but she'd wanted cash fast with no questions asked. When Daniel asked why, the owner said she'd mentioned moving and starting over somewhere new. She'd seemed scared, he added, constantly looking over her shoulder like someone was following her. Daniel asked if she'd said where she was going. The owner replied that he hadn't asked and didn't care, but noted that she'd probably be back. They always came back when they ran out of money. Daniel walked back to his car, his mind racing. Elena was alive. She was in the city. She was selling her possessions for cash, which meant she was running from something or someone. The funeral had been staged. The death certificate was fake. But why? What had Elena gotten involved in that required her to disappear so completely? He pulled out his phone and scrolled through their old text messages. Most were mundane, plans for dinner, complaints about work. But near the end, before she'd stopped responding, there were hints of something else. Can't talk right now. We'll call you later. Things are complicated. Need some time to figure it out. I might have to go away for a while. I'm sorry. That was 6 months ago, the last message she'd ever sent him. Daniel stared at the phone screen until his eyes burned. Elena was out there, somewhere in the city, hiding behind a fake death and a misspelled name. She was scared, she was running, and she was selling everything she owned to stay one step ahead of whatever was hunting her. He started the car and pulled into traffic, Elena's shoe still heavy in his pocket. The city stretched out before him, full of shadows and secrets, and women who looked like ghosts. But one of them was real. One of them was Elena, and he was going to find her. Daniel's apartment felt smaller at night, the walls pressing in with accumulated silence. He paced between his living room and kitchen, Elena's shoe beside his laptop on the coffee table, staring at a login screen he'd accessed 100 times in his mind, but never dared to try. 3 years ago, Elena had locked herself out of her secondary email account, the one she used for online shopping and newsletters. Nothing important, she'd said, just annoying to lose. He'd helped her recover it, walking her through security questions and password resets. Her backup email was still active. He'd checked it compulsively for months after she'd left, hoping for some sign she was thinking of him. But it had been empty then, silent. Now he typed in the recovery credentials he'd memorized. The password she'd chosen was simple, predictable, her mother's maiden name followed by her birth year. In her emotional state, she'd probably fallen back on familiar patterns, rather than creating something secure. The kind of careless mistake someone makes when desperation overrides caution. The inbox loaded, 43 unread messages. Most were spam, credit card offers, clothing sales, subscription renewals. But buried in the digital noise were fragments of something else. Messages from addresses he didn't recognize. Conversations that made no sense. Package received. Next steps. Verification complete. Welcome to the program. Your consultation is scheduled for Tuesday. Remember, total discretion. Exit protocol updated. Please confirm receipt. Daniel clicked on the oldest message. It was from 6 months ago, around the time Elena had stopped responding to his texts. The sender was listed as Transition Services with a generic email address. Elena, thank you for your interest in our program. We understand the stress of overwhelming financial obligations and the need for a fresh start. Our services are discreet, legal, and have helped hundreds of clients achieve true financial freedom. Your consultation is scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. Please bring all relevant documentation as discussed. Remember, complete confidentiality is essential to the process. Given the sensitive nature of our work, we maintain strict security protocols, but we've found that clients with Elena's particular circumstances often require additional protective measures. Looking forward to helping you begin your new life. Daniel scrolled through the rest of the messages. The tone became more urgent, more specific. references to debt migration and identity transition, instructions for document preparation, warnings about the importance of secrecy. The final message was dated 3 weeks ago, the day before Elena's supposed death. Elena, final confirmation received. Your new documentation is ready for pickup. Remember, once the process begins, there can be no contact with your previous life. This is for your safety and the safety of others in the program. Your new identity package includes Social Security card, birth certificate, driver's license, credit report, employment history. Welcome to your new life, Elena Grey. Daniel stood by his window, hands shaking as he processed what he'd read. Elena hadn't died. She'd been reborn, transformed from a woman drowning in debt into someone with a clean slate and a new name. But the funeral had been real. The casket had been real. Someone had died to make Elena's new life possible. He picked up Elena's shoe and turned it over in his hands. The leather was soft, worn smooth by years of wear. She'd walked thousands of miles in these shoes, through their relationship, through its ending, through whatever desperation had driven her to fake her own death. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Stop looking. You're putting her in danger. Daniel stared at the message until the screen went dark. Someone was watching him. Someone knew he'd found Elena's secret email. Someone who wanted him to stop asking questions. But he couldn't stop. Elena was out there, living under a stolen name, hiding from something that required her to disappear completely. She was scared. She was alone. And she was pretending to be dead to stay safe. Daniel deleted the text and turned his phone face down on the table. Tomorrow, he would find out how someone could buy a new identity and bury their old life 6 feet deep. Tonight, he stood at his window watching the city lights and wondered what kind of danger was worth dying to escape. Daniel found the debt support forum through a link in one of Elena's emails. It was buried in a thread about bankruptcy alternatives, disguised as a legitimate resource for people overwhelmed by financial obligations. The forum required registration. He created a fake account and spent hours reading through posts. Most were genuine, people sharing stories of foreclosure, job loss, medical debt. But scattered throughout were conversations that felt different. Coded language, careful phrasing, people talking about starting over and disappearing and the only way out. He found Elena's username buried in a thread from 8 months ago. She'd been asking questions about debt forgiveness programs, legal loopholes, ways to escape crushing financial obligations without declaring bankruptcy. Other users had responded with sympathy and similar stories, but 3 users had sent private messages. Their profiles were sparse, their post histories brief. They offered hope where others offered only commiseration. Daniel tried to access the private messages, but Elena's account had been deactivated. The thread itself had been edited, key posts removed. But the internet never truly forgot anything, especially when web crawlers had preserved snapshots before the deletions. One username kept appearing, Debt-Free 2019. They'd been active on the forum for 4 years, always offering advice to people in desperate situations, always steering conversations toward private messages and off-site communication. Daniel clicked on their profile. It had been scrubbed clean, but the cached version told a different story. Debt-Free 2019 had made over 3,000 posts. They'd helped dozens of people find solutions to their financial problems. Their signature line read, "There's always a way out. You just have to be willing to pay the price." The private message system was still active. Daniel composed a careful message, posing as someone overwhelmed by debt and desperate for alternatives. He mentioned Elena's username, claimed to be a friend who'd lost touch after she'd found help. The response came within an hour. Debt-Free 2019 remembered Elena, calling her a sweet girl with an unfortunate situation. The program had helped her find peace, they claimed. If Daniel was seriously interested in alternatives, they could arrange a consultation, but he had to understand this wasn't for everyone. Complete commitment to starting over was required. No contact with the old life, no looking back. The price was significant, but so was the freedom. The message ended with a direct question. Was Daniel ready to disappear? Daniel typed back that he was ready and wanted to know how it worked. The response was chilling. This wasn't debt consolidation or bankruptcy, they explained. This was complete identity replacement. New name, new social security number, new life history. The old self dies, legally, financially, socially. You become someone else. The process took 3 months and cost $50,000, non-negotiable and non-refundable. Elena's last text had been 6 months ago, yet she'd only been reborn 3 weeks ago. Daniel realized there must have been an interim period. Perhaps she'd gotten cold feet initially, or spent months gathering the courage to fully commit to such a drastic step. But the result was complete debt forgiveness, clean credit, and a new life where the past couldn't follow. The final line was stark. Once you start, there's no going back. Your old life ends. Your new life begins. Are you sure you're ready to die? When Daniel asked what happened to the old identity and how they made it disappear, the response took longer to arrive. Debt-Free 2019 said that wasn't his concern. Their methods were proprietary and completely legal. They specialized in helping people escape situations where traditional solutions weren't possible. If he was having second thoughts, this wasn't for him. The program only worked for people completely committed to letting go of their past. Elena had understood that, they wrote. She'd made her choice and found her peace. The final question hung in the digital air. What was Daniel's choice? Daniel closed the laptop and walked to his window. The city stretched out below, full of people living their lives, carrying their histories, connected to their past. Elena was out there somewhere, cut off from everything she'd ever known, pretending to be dead to stay safe. But safe from what? What had driven her to such desperate measures? His phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number. Stop digging. Last warning. Daniel looked at the message, then at Elena's shoe sitting on his table. Someone was watching him. Someone knew he was getting closer to the truth. But Elena was still out there, still hiding, still pretending to be someone else. And he was the only one who remembered who she really was. Daniel knew something was wrong the moment he reached his apartment door. The lock was intact, the deadbolt still engaged, but the door frame showed subtle signs of interference, tiny scratches around the strike plate, a slight gap where the door didn't quite sit flush. Inside, everything looked normal. His couch in the same position, his coffee table clear except for Elena's shoe, his laptop exactly where he'd left it. They'd clearly copied files quickly rather than risk triggering security alerts by taking the computer itself. But his apartment felt different, violated, like someone had been breathing his air, touching his things, examining his life. He checked his bedroom first. The dresser drawers were closed but not quite aligned. His closet door was open an inch wider than usual. His bed was made the same way, but the pillow was positioned differently. In the kitchen, he opened his junk drawer. The USB drive was gone. Daniel sat down hard. The drive had contained backups of his work files, personal documents, and photos, including photos of Elena, including screenshots of their text conversations, including everything he'd printed from the debt forum. Someone had been here. Someone had taken the one thing that connected him to Elena's past. His phone rang. Unknown number. Daniel answered cautiously. A woman's voice, barely above a whisper, spoke his name. Elena? She told him he needed to stop looking for her. When he asked where she was and if she was safe, she said she wasn't Elena anymore. Elena was dead. He'd seen the funeral. Daniel protested that he'd seen her at the pawn shop, that she was alive. After a long pause, during which he could hear traffic in the background and the distant sound of a payphone's mechanical hum, she admitted that they knew he was asking questions. They knew he'd found her email. When Daniel asked who they were, Elena explained they were the people who had given her a new life, the people keeping her safe. Safe from what? From the people who want me dead. Daniel gripped the phone tighter and asked her to tell him where she was, to let him help. But Elena said he couldn't help her. No one could. She'd made her choice. Daniel pressed her about what choice, what she'd done. Elena's voice broke slightly as she explained. She'd run, hidden, let them bury someone else under her name so she could disappear. When Daniel asked who they'd buried, Elena said she didn't know. She couldn't ask. Daniel called it insane, but Elena cut him off, asking what he thought she couldn't do. Live? Because that's what she was doing, living. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of every phone call, every knock at the door, every shadow that might be someone coming to collect. Daniel asked what they were collecting. Elena's response was quiet but devastating. More than money, more than she could ever pay. After a moment of careful breathing, Daniel asked to see her, to help her figure things out. But Elena said there was nothing to figure out. She was dead. He'd buried her. Now he had to let her stay buried. When Daniel said he couldn't do that, Elena's voice turned urgent. They were watching him now. They knew he wouldn't stop. And if he didn't stop, they'd stop him. Daniel asked if that was a threat. Elena's final words carried the weight of desperate love. It's a warning from someone who cares about you enough to risk everything to give it. Daniel walked to his window. The street below looked normal. Cars parked along the curb, pedestrians walking their dogs. But somewhere in that ordinary scene, someone was watching. Someone who knew he'd found Elena's secret. Daniel asked about the funeral, about who they had buried. Elena said she didn't know. When he pressed her, pointing out that someone had to die for her to get a new identity, Elena's response was chilling. People died every day, she said. They just repurposed some of them. Daniel was horrified as he realized she was talking about stealing dead people's identities. Elena's voice turned defensive as she insisted she was talking about survival. Daniel started to argue that this wasn't survival, but the line went dead. Daniel called back immediately. The number was disconnected. He walked back to his couch, staring at Elena's shoe, trying to process what he'd just heard. She was alive. She was hiding. She was living under a stolen identity while someone else moldered in her grave. And she was so afraid of her past that she'd rather pretend to be dead than face it. But what past? What had Elena done that required such desperate measures? His laptop chimed, a new email in his personal account. Daniel, I know you spoke with her. I know you won't stop looking. Meet me tomorrow, 7 p.m., Central Library, 3rd floor. Come alone. I have information you need. A friend. Daniel deleted the email and closed the laptop. Someone wanted to meet. Someone who knew he'd found Elena. Someone who claimed to have information. It could be a trap. It could be the people who'd broken into his apartment. It could be the ones who'd buried a stranger under Elena's name. But it could also be someone who knew the truth. Someone who could help him understand what Elena was running from. Daniel picked up Elena's shoe and held it in his hands. The leather was soft, familiar. It smelled faintly of her perfume, even after all these months. Tomorrow, he would go to the library. He would meet this friend and find out what information they had to offer. Tonight, he would sit in his violated apartment and wonder what kind of past was worth dying to escape. The Central Library's 3rd floor was nearly empty at 7 o'clock. Daniel found her in the economics section, sitting at a table with a stack of books and a laptop that looked like it had been through a war. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 30, with short blonde hair and nervous eyes that constantly scanned the room. She wore a green jacket that had seen better days and kept her hands wrapped around a coffee cup like it was an anchor. She confirmed she was Sarah and introduced herself as a former employee of transition services until 3 months ago, when she'd figured out what they were really doing. Sarah opened a manila folder and spread documents across the table. They'd been helping people disappear, she explained, legally and completely. They told clients they were a debt restructuring firm, financial consultants, but really, they were identity brokers. Daniel studied the papers, forms with official letterheads, social security applications, death certificates. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper as she explained their process. They'd find people with overwhelming debt, people desperate enough to consider extreme measures. Then they'd offer them a way out, complete identity replacement for $50,000. Sarah noted that Daniel had been doing research. The money covered documentation, processing, and ongoing protection. But that wasn't the real cost. She pulled out a photograph showing a woman in her 30s with dark hair and familiar features. But it wasn't Elena. This was Amy Chen, Sarah explained. 28 years old, overdosed in a hotel room 6 months ago. No family, no friends, no one to claim the body. 3 days later, Elena Grey was declared dead, and Amy Chen became Elena Grey. Daniel's stomach turned. They were stealing identities from dead people. Sarah corrected him. Not stealing, repurposing. The dead don't need their social security numbers anymore, but people running from dangerous situations do. Sarah hesitated, then pulled out another file. This one was thicker, full of printed emails and financial records. Elena wasn't just running from debt. She was running from her ex-boyfriend, Marcus Webb, who worked for a private lending company specializing in high-risk loans. Daniel had never heard the name. Sarah explained that Webb was from before Daniel's time. 2 years before, Elena had borrowed money from Webb's company when her mother was dying. Medical bills, experimental treatments. She'd been desperate. The initial loan was $30,000, but the interest compounded weekly with brutal penalties. By the time her mother died, Elena owed over $200,000. Daniel felt sick. Elena had never mentioned her mother's illness or the debt. She'd carried that burden alone while they were together. Sarah continued explaining that Webb's company had collection methods that went beyond legal boundaries. Harassment, threats, violence. Elena had tried to pay, but the debt kept growing faster than she could manage it. She'd faked her death to survive. Webb's people had started making threats against her friends, her family, anyone close to her. They were still looking for her. They knew she was alive, knew someone had helped her disappear, and knew Daniel was asking questions. Sarah closed the folder and leaned back. What Transition Services was doing was wrong. They were helping people, yes, but they were also enabling something worse. The same people who hunted debtors like Elena were the ones providing cover for their disappearance. Webb's company had connections to Transition Services. They profited from creating the problem and selling the solution. Daniel understood. It was a cycle, a very profitable one. Lend money to desperate people at impossible rates. When they can't pay, offer them a way out that costs even more. Then use their desperation to create new identities that can be sold to the next generation of victims. Sarah stood and gathered her papers. Her voice carried a weight of personal experience as she continued. She'd seen too many families destroyed, both the ones left behind by people who disappeared and the ones who got pulled into the system thinking it was salvation. I helped process Elena's transition, she said quietly. But Elena never knew my real name. We operated under strict compartmentalization for security. She probably didn't trust anyone by the end anyway, not after what she'd been through. Elena was probably safer than Daniel was right now, but if he kept looking for her, he'd lead them right to her. Daniel said he couldn't just stop. Sarah advised him to be smart about it. Stop using his real name, stop leaving digital trails, and stop trusting anyone who claimed they wanted to help. She handed him a business card, blank except for an email address. If he found something that could help expose this, he should contact her. But he needed to understand. Once you start fighting them, there's no going back to your normal life. Sarah gathered her papers and stood to leave. She warned Daniel to be careful. These people didn't just threaten, they followed through. She paused with final advice. If he really cared about Elena, he should stop looking for her. The best thing you can do for her now is forget she ever existed. Sarah walked away between the tall stacks, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. Daniel sat alone with the weight of what he'd learned. Elena wasn't just hiding. She was trapped in a system that profited from desperation, that turned people's love for each other into chains. But she was alive, breathing, existing somewhere in the city under a borrowed name. And despite everything Sarah had told him, despite the warnings and the threats and the very real danger, Daniel knew he couldn't stop looking. Elena had sacrificed everything to protect him. Now it was his turn to protect her, even if she didn't want to be saved. Daniel found the second funeral through the debt forum. A user named Bankrupt in Boston had posted about attending his own memorial service, then disappeared from the site entirely. The post had been deleted, but cached versions still existed in the depths of the internet. Robert Chen, 45, beloved father and dedicated teacher, passed away peacefully after a long battle with cancer. The funeral was at the same chapel, Sacred Heart. 2 days after Elena's service, Daniel arrived early and watched from across the street. The mourners looked different this time, genuine grief instead of polite obligation. A woman in her 40s clutched a young boy's hand. Teachers from Robert's school, students who had loved him. They were burying an empty casket. During the service, Daniel slipped around to the back of the chapel. The loading dock was hidden from the main entrance, accessible through an alley that reeked of garbage and stagnant water. A black sedan was parked there, engine running. 2 men in suits stood beside the car, talking in low voices. One was checking his watch. The other was smoking a cigarette with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd been waiting too long. Daniel crept closer, staying in the shadows between dumpsters. The men's conversation carried on the still air. They discussed how the family was taking it hard, noting that this emotional response was what made their operation work. One asked if Chen's documentation was clean, and the other confirmed it was. New social security number, new credit history, new work background. Chen's case had been expedited due to his family's religious preferences for quick burial, allowing them to fast-track the identity transfer before questions could arise. When one asked about the wife, the other replied that she thought her husband was dead, which was better. It made it easier for her to move on. Daniel's blood turned cold. Robert Chen was alive. His family was grieving for a man who had been given a new identity and a new life. They would never know their husband and father had chosen to disappear rather than face his debts. The men finished their conversation and drove away. Daniel waited until the funeral ended, then followed the family to the cemetery. Robert's grave was 3 plots away from Elena's. The headstone was granite, the inscription simple and heartbreaking. Robert Chen, 1978 to 2023, beloved husband and father. The woman and boy stood beside the grave long after the other mourners had left. She held a single red rose. He clutched a drawing that looked like a family portrait. Daniel wanted to tell them, wanted to explain that their grief was unnecessary, that Robert was alive somewhere, starting over with a new name and a clean slate. But he couldn't. The knowledge would destroy them in a different way. Hope could be crueler than grief. He walked back to his car, his phone buzzing with another text. "You're learning too much. Back off now." Daniel deleted the message and drove home. His apartment felt different again. Not violated this time, but watched, like invisible eyes were tracking his every movement. Daniel stood by his living room window, watching the evening traffic flow past like a river of light. He thought about Robert Chen's family, about the wife who would never remarry because she thought her husband was dead, about the boy who would grow up believing his father had abandoned him to cancer. Elena had made the same choice. She had chosen to let Daniel think she was dead rather than risk his safety. She was protecting him by breaking his heart. But unlike Robert's family, Daniel knew the truth. He knew Elena was alive, hiding behind a stolen identity, living with the guilt of someone else's grave. The question was, what was he going to do about it? His laptop chimed, a new email from Sarah. "Daniel, I've been digging deeper into Webb's operation. Found something you need to see. Same place, same time tomorrow. Come prepared for the worst." Daniel closed the laptop and picked up Elena's shoe. The leather was warm from his hands, soft from years of wear. Elena had walked thousands of miles in these shoes, through their relationship, through its ending, through whatever desperation had driven her to choose death over debt. Tomorrow, he would meet Sarah again. He would learn more about the system that had swallowed Elena whole. He would get closer to understanding the full scope of what she was running from. But tonight, he stood in his watched apartment and wondered if knowing the truth was worth the price Elena had paid to hide from it. The photograph arrived in Daniel's mailbox without explanation. No postmark, no return address, just a manila envelope with his name written in block letters. The same handwriting style as someone who had clearly studied his address from the USB drive they'd stolen from his apartment. Inside was a single color print, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. It showed Elena sitting on a bench at a train station, wearing the same gray coat he'd seen at the pawn shop. Her hair was shorter, darker, she looked tired, but she was alive. On the back, someone had written in the same block letters, "Stop looking, or the next photo will be her last." Daniel studied the image. The train station looked familiar, but he couldn't place it. The timestamp in the corner showed it had been taken yesterday. Whoever was watching Elena was also watching him. His hands shook as he turned the photograph over again. Elena looked so small, so alone. She was checking her phone, her shoulders hunched against the cold. She had no idea someone was documenting her every move. The photograph was a message. "We know where she is. We're watching her. One wrong move from you, and she disappears for real." Daniel set the photo on his kitchen table next to Elena's shoe. 2 pieces of physical evidence that she had existed, that she was still existing somewhere in the world. Everything else about her was digital ghosts and faded memories. His phone rang. Sarah. Sarah asked if he'd received the package. When Daniel asked what package, she told him to check his mailbox, saying she'd sent him documents. Daniel asked about the photograph. Sarah seemed confused, asking what photograph. She'd sent financial records from Webb's company, evidence of the identity trafficking operation. Daniel ran to his mailbox. Later that day, he checked again and found another manila envelope, this one with a return address from a copy shop downtown. Inside were dozens of pages, bank statements, loan agreements, email printouts. He carried everything back to his apartment and spread it across his table. The financial records painted a clear picture of Webb's operation: loans designed to trap borrowers in cycles of debt, collection methods that crossed legal boundaries, and connections to transition services that went deeper than Sarah had originally suspected. Webb's company wasn't just a client of the identity trafficking ring, they were partners. They identified potential candidates for transition, people so desperate they would pay anything for a way out. Then they referred those people to transition services, taking a cut of the $50,000 fee. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the insurance policies. Each person who died through the program had a life insurance policy taken out in their name months before their transition. The beneficiaries were shell companies connected to Webb's operation. When someone like Elena or Robert Chen officially died, the insurance paid out, double profit from the same victim. Daniel found Elena's policy buried in the stack of papers, $250,000, enough to cover her original debt 3 times over. The beneficiary was listed as Grey Holdings LLC, a company that existed only on paper. They hadn't just helped Elena fake her death, they'd profited from it. His phone buzzed, another text from the unknown number telling him he had 30 minutes to destroy everything he'd found. They were watching. Daniel looked at the photograph of Elena. She was still checking her phone, unaware that her life hung in the balance of decisions made by people she'd never met. He gathered all the documents and carried them to his kitchen sink, turned on the gas burner, held the first page over the flame, then stopped. Elena was hiding because she thought it was the only way to protect the people she loved, but her protection was built on other people's suffering. Robert Chen's family, Amy Chen's forgotten grave, countless others who had been erased and replaced to feed a system that profited from desperation. Daniel turned off the burner and carried the documents to his scanner. If they wanted to threaten Elena, they would have to deal with him first. He scanned every page, uploaded the files to multiple cloud storage accounts, and sent copies to Sarah with instructions to release everything if something happened to him. Then he sat at his table with Elena's shoe and the photograph of her at the train station. She looked so fragile, so alone, but she was stronger than she knew. She had survived Webb's threats. She had escaped his system. She had found a way to live when living seemed impossible. Now it was his turn to be strong. His phone rang, unknown number. A man's voice told Daniel he'd made a mistake. When Daniel asked which mistake, the voice said thinking he could protect Elena by exposing them. Daniel replied that he was thinking he could protect a lot of people by exposing them. The voice warned that Elena wouldn't survive what was coming next. Daniel reminded the caller that Elena was already dead. They'd buried her themselves. After a long pause, the voice said Daniel didn't understand what he was dealing with. "I understand enough," Daniel said. The caller gave him an ultimatum. "Meet them tomorrow at noon in the warehouse district, Pier 47. Come alone, or Elena dies for real this time." The line went dead. Daniel looked at the photograph one more time. Elena sitting alone at a train station, checking her phone, unaware that her past was about to catch up with her. Tomorrow, he would meet the people who had turned her life into a commodity. He would face the system that had given her freedom by stealing it from someone else. Tonight, he would sit in his apartment and remember what she'd looked like when she was happy, when she was alive in more than just the technical sense, when she was Elena Grey instead of Elena Grey, before she'd learned that sometimes the only way to live was to die first. Pier 47 sat at the dead end of the warehouse district, where the city gave way to industrial decay and forgotten waterfront. Daniel arrived 20 minutes early, parking where he could watch the approach roads. The warehouse was a hulking concrete structure, its windows boarded over, its loading docks sealed with rust and neglect. At exactly noon, a black sedan pulled up to the main entrance. 2 men got out. One was tall and thin, wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place in the industrial wasteland. The other was shorter, heavier, with the kind of build that suggested violence was a professional tool. Daniel recognized the thin man from the chapel loading dock. He walked with the confidence of someone who owned the world, or at least the parts of it that mattered. Daniel sat in his car for 5 more minutes, steadying his breathing. He approached the warehouse. The main door was unlocked. Inside, the space was cavernous and dim, lit by dusty skylights that cast long shadows across the concrete floor. The air smelled of machine oil and decades of abandonment. The two men stood in the center of the space, waiting. The thin man introduced himself as Marcus Webb and observed that Daniel knew why they were here. Daniel said nothing, studying the space for exits, weapons, anything that might help if this went wrong. Webb noted that Daniel had been asking questions about Elena Grey, digging into business that didn't concern him, making problems for people who didn't appreciate problems. When Daniel replied that Elena was dead and they'd buried her themselves, Webb smiled with the kind of expression that belonged in a morgue. Elena Grey was dead. Yes, he agreed. But Elena Grey was very much alive and had been recaptured by the program. The surveillance and control mechanisms that had seemed like protection were actually chains that could be tightened at will. Daniel's heart stopped as he demanded to know where she was. Webb said she was safe for now, but whether she stayed safe depended entirely on Daniel's next decisions. The heavier man stepped forward with a tablet computer, turning it so Daniel could see the screen. Security camera footage showed Elena sitting in what looked like a hotel room, her hands zip-tied behind her back. She was alive, but scared. Her eyes kept darting to something off-camera. Webb explained the video was taken about an hour ago. Elena had been asking about Daniel, actually. She seemed to think he could save her. Webb's smile widened as he asked if Daniel could. Daniel asked what they wanted. Webb explained it was simple. Daniel had information that belonged to them. Financial records, insurance documents, evidence of business practices that some people might find questionable. They wanted it back. When Daniel claimed he didn't have anything, Webb pulled out his own tablet. Of course he did, Webb said. He'd scanned everything, uploaded it to cloud storage, sent copies to his new friend Sarah. Did he think they weren't watching? Did he think they didn't know about his little insurance policy? Daniel's blood turned cold. If they knew about Sarah, she was in danger too. Webb outlined what would happen next. Daniel would delete every file, cancel every backup, destroy every piece of evidence he'd collected, and then he would disappear. When Daniel asked what that meant, Webb explained they were offering him the same deal they'd offered Elena. New identity, clean slate, $50,000 in debt forgiveness. He could start over somewhere else as someone else. Daniel asked what would happen if he refused. Webb nodded to his partner, who tapped the tablet screen. The camera angle changed. Elena was no longer alone in the room. A man stood behind her, his face obscured by shadows. Webb made his message clear. Elena would die, Sarah would die, and Daniel would die, but not quickly. Daniel stared at the screen. Elena looked so small, so helpless. She had sacrificed everything to escape these people, and now they had her again because of him. When Daniel demanded proof she was alive and asked to talk to her, Webb shook his head. Daniel didn't make demands here, Webb explained. He made choices. Daniel pulled out his phone and announced he'd recorded the entire conversation. If anything happened to Elena, Sarah, or himself, the recording would go to every news outlet in the city, along with all the financial records Webb wanted back. Webb's smile faltered as he accused Daniel of bluffing. Daniel's response was simple and direct. Try me. The warehouse fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic and seagulls crying over the water. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light from the skylights above. Webb studied Daniel's face, looking for tells, for weakness, for any sign that he wasn't serious. Webb finally explained that Daniel didn't understand what he was dealing with. This went beyond Elena, beyond debt collection, beyond anything he could imagine. They had resources he couldn't fight, connections he couldn't break, reach he couldn't escape. Daniel acknowledged that might be true, but he had something they didn't have. Nothing left to lose. As Daniel backed toward the door, his phone still in his hand, he delivered his ultimatum. 24 hours to release Elena and Sarah, unharmed, or everything goes public. Webb called it a mistake. Daniel agreed it probably was, but said it was his mistake to make. Daniel reached the door and stepped outside. The sedan was still parked by the entrance, but he could see another car approaching from the distance. Backup, or cleanup crew. He ran to his own car and drove away as fast as the city streets would allow. In his rearview mirror, he could see the sedan following, keeping pace but not closing the distance. They wanted him to know he was being watched, wanted him to understand that nowhere was safe. But Daniel had made his choice. Elena was alive. She was in danger because of him, and he was the only one who could save her. even if it meant joining her in whatever grave they'd prepared for people who asked too many questions. Daniel's apartment had been destroyed, every drawer pulled out and dumped, every cushion slashed open, every book thrown from its shelf. His laptop was gone, his backup drives were gone. Even Elena's shoe was missing from his kitchen table, but they had missed the most important thing. Daniel pulled his phone from his pocket and opened the app he'd installed that morning. A dead man's switch, programmed to release everything if he didn't check in every 12 hours. Webb's people could take his computer, his files, his life, but they couldn't stop information that was already in motion. He had 8 hours left on the timer. Sarah answered on the first ring, immediately telling Daniel they'd taken her sister, grabbing her outside her apartment that morning. They were using her as leverage. When Daniel asked where Sarah was, she said she was in a safe house, but not for long. They'd found her real identity, her family, her life. This was bigger than they'd thought. Webb's operation wasn't just about debt collection and identity trafficking. It was about control. Daniel asked what she meant. Sarah explained that people who disappeared through the program didn't just get new identities. They got new jobs, new lives, new purposes, but they weren't free. They were owned. When Daniel asked if Elena was working for them, Sarah confirmed that everyone who went through the program worked for them. It was indentured servitude disguised as they fake your death, give you a new identity, and then you spend the rest of your life paying them back through whatever work they assign. Daniel asked what kind of work. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper as she listed the activities: money laundering, document fraud, identity theft, corporate espionage, whatever they needed. Elena wasn't hiding from Webb's people. She was working for them. Daniel recalled Elena's warning call and said she'd told him to stop looking. Sarah explained that was Elena's job now. Keep him away from the truth. Keep everyone away from the truth. When Daniel asked why they were threatening to kill her then, Sarah revealed the truth. Elena had been trying to escape. The video Daniel had seen, the zip ties, the fear, that wasn't them threatening her life, but her freedom. If she didn't bring Daniel in, they'd activate her termination protocol. Daniel asked what that meant. Sarah's voice was grim as she explained the psychological control mechanisms that kept people trapped. They didn't need tracking devices or physical implants when they had something much more powerful: surveillance, fear, and leverage over everyone you'd ever cared about. Elena's not just afraid for herself, Sarah said. They've shown her what happens to people who try to leave. They have files on you, on me, on everyone connected to their operation. Step out of line, try to run, expose anything, and they don't just kill you. They destroy everyone you've ever loved first, make you watch. Daniel's blood turned cold as he asked if Elena had one of these files on him. Sarah confirmed everyone did. Detailed surveillance, daily routines, vulnerabilities. They knew where he worked, where he shopped, what route he took home. They'd studied him for months before Elena ever contacted him. When Daniel asked about the insurance policies, Sarah said those were real. When someone dies for real, the companies collect. When someone escapes or gets terminated, they still collect. Either way, they profit. Sarah told Daniel they couldn't save Elena, her sister, or any of the others. They were already dead in every way that mattered. They could only expose the system and hope it prevented more people from getting trapped. Daniel refused to give up on Elena. Sarah warned that he was going to get Elena killed, along with himself and anyone else who got close to this. Daniel's phone chimed with a new text from an unknown number. 6 hours to meet at Riverside Park's north entrance with everything he'd stolen, or Elena's new life ends permanently. When Daniel showed the message to Sarah over video chat, her face went pale. She called it a trap. They were going to kill them both. Daniel said maybe so, but Elena was still alive. And as long as she was alive, there was hope. Sarah asked hope for what? Even if he could somehow free Elena from their psychological control, her old identity was dead. She could never go back to being Elena Grey. She'd always be a ghost. Daniel thought about the funeral, the empty casket, the headstone with the wrong name. Elena had attended her own burial, had watched her old life disappear into the ground, but she was still breathing, still thinking, still capable of choice. That had to be enough. When Daniel announced he was going to the park, Sarah pleaded with him not to, asking him to let her contact the FBI instead. He hung up and disabled his phone's location tracking. Sarah was right about almost everything. The system was too big to fight. The corruption went too deep to expose. The people trapped in it were too controlled to save. But Elena wasn't a system or a statistic. She was a person who had made impossible choices to survive impossible circumstances. She deserved better than to die alone, afraid, enslaved by the people who had promised her freedom. Daniel picked up his car keys and headed for the door. In 6 hours, he would meet Webb's people at the park. He would face whatever trap they had prepared. He would probably die, but Elena would know in her final moments that someone had remembered who she really was. Someone had refused to let Elena Grey stay dead. Riverside Park after dark was a different world. The families and joggers were gone, replaced by shadows and the distant sound of water lapping against concrete. Daniel arrived early and found a position where he could watch the north entrance while staying hidden among the trees. At exactly midnight, Webb appeared with Elena. She walked beside him like a sleepwalker, her movements careful and controlled. In the pale streetlight, Daniel could see the exhaustion in her posture, the fear in the way she kept her eyes down. She wore the same gray coat from the pawn shop, the same one from the photograph, but she was alive. Webb had brought backup. 2 cars were parked at different entrances to the park. Daniel counted at least 4 other men positioned around the meeting point. This wasn't an exchange. This was an execution disguised as a negotiation. Daniel's phone vibrated. A text from Sarah saying the FBI was on the way, and to stall them. He looked at his phone's timer. 4 hours until the dead man's switch activated. 4 hours until every major news outlet in the city received a complete archive of Webb's operation. Unless he reset the timer. Unless he chose Elena's life over exposing the truth. Daniel stepped out from the trees and walked toward the meeting point. Webb saw him coming and smiled that morgue smile. Webb greeted Daniel and said how good it was of him to join them. Elena looked up at the sound of Daniel's name. Even in the dim light, Daniel could see the recognition in her eyes and the fear. When Daniel demanded they let her go, Webb agreed. As soon as Daniel deleted everything he'd stolen from them, Daniel asked to see the device first, the thing they'd implanted in her. Webb's smile faltered as he claimed not to know what Daniel was talking about. When Daniel described the tracking device and kill switch, asking to see how to remove it, Webb looked genuinely puzzled. There was no device, he said. They weren't monsters. Daniel felt the world shift beneath his feet as he asked how they controlled them. Webb replied that control was an illusion. People controlled themselves. He gestured at Elena and told her to explain, to tell Daniel why she worked for them. Elena finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, "Because they'll hurt you if I don't." When Daniel asked what she meant, Elena explained that Webb's people would hurt him, Sarah, anyone who got close to the truth. That's how they maintained control, not through devices or threats to the victims, but through threats to the people they cared about. Daniel understood. The system wasn't built on technology or violence. It was built on love, on the knowledge that people would sacrifice anything to protect the ones they cared about. Elena hadn't been enslaved by an implant. She'd been enslaved by her own compassion. When Daniel asked if she worked for them to keep him safe, Elena confirmed it. She worked for them to keep everyone safe. The families of people who got new identities, the loved ones of people who escaped their debts. All of them were held hostage by their own hearts. Webb nodded approvingly, explaining that Daniel now understood. This wasn't about money or power. It was about family. Elena chose to work for them because she loved Daniel. Daniel would choose to delete those files because he loved her. Sarah would choose to stay quiet because she loved her sister. When Daniel asked what would happen if he didn't, Webb said Elena would die, not from some imaginary device, but from a very real bullet, and her death would be Daniel's fault. Daniel looked at Elena. She was studying his face, trying to read his thoughts. In her eyes, he saw resignation. She had accepted that this was how her story would end. In a park, in the dark, surrounded by people who profited from desperation. Daniel announced there was a third option and pulled out his phone to show Webb the timer. 3 hours and 57 minutes. When Webb accused him of bluffing, Daniel explained the ultimatum. In 4 hours, everything went public. Every document, every financial record, every name, including Webb's, Elena's, and everyone who ever worked for the operation. Webb's face went white as Daniel continued. If Elena died, the information got released. If he died, the information got released. If he reset the timer, Elena lived, but the information stayed hidden. He looked at Elena and told her it was her choice. Elena stared at him, asking if he would destroy her new life to save her old one. Daniel said he would give her the choice. Elena Grey could disappear forever. Elena Grey could face whatever came next, but she got to decide who she wanted to be. Webb stepped between them, calling it insane. Daniel would destroy hundreds of lives. People who were finally free from their past would be dragged back into it. Daniel countered that people trapped in a system they never understood would finally be free to make real choices. Elena closed her eyes. When she opened them, Daniel saw something he hadn't seen in years. Hope. A pause hung in the air like a held breath. "Do it," she said quietly. Webb protested, telling her to think about what she was saying, but Elena's voice was stronger now, each word deliberate and clear. "My name is Elena Grey." Another pause, the weight of identity settling back into place. "I died 3 weeks ago in a casket that held someone else's body. I've been pretending to be Elena Grey to protect people I love, but I'm tired of pretending." She looked at Webb. "I'm tired of being afraid." Webb reached inside his jacket and pulled out a phone, giving Daniel 10 seconds to reset the timer, or he'd make a call, and Elena would die right there. Daniel looked at his phone screen. 3 hours and 55 minutes. He thought about Robert Chen's family, still grieving for a man who was alive. About Amy Chen, forgotten in Elena's grave. About all the people trapped in a system that promised freedom but delivered only different chains. He thought about Elena, who had chosen love over safety, truth over survival. Daniel held up his phone and announced he'd created 2 apps, one real, one decoy. He was deleting the decoy timer now, but the real dead man's switch was still running on a second device. No more games. Webb's smile faltered as he accused Daniel of bluffing. Daniel's response was simple and direct. "Try me." But Daniel was already moving. As Webb reached for his weapon, Daniel threw himself sideways, grabbing Elena and pulling her toward the trees. Gunshots cracked through the night air. Shouts erupted behind them. Footsteps pounded against pavement. They crashed through the underbrush, Elena stumbling but keeping pace. Daniel could hear pursuit, but they had a head start and the advantage of desperation. Elena gasped for him to follow her and pulled him toward a maintenance shed near the water. They squeezed behind the building just as flashlight beams swept across the area where they'd been moments before. Elena was breathing hard, her face pale in the moonlight. She whispered about the timer, asking if he'd really created 2 apps. Daniel told her yes. One decoy he could delete for show, and the real one still counting down. Elena's eyes widened as she asked how long was left. 2 hours and 40 minutes, Daniel replied. When Elena started to protest about Webb, Daniel cut her off, explaining that Webb would do what he'd always done, try to control people through fear. But Sarah had already contacted the FBI. The story was going public whether they lived or died. Footsteps approached their hiding spot. Elena pressed herself against the shed wall, her breathing shallow. She whispered, asking why he'd risk everything for someone who was already dead. Daniel's response was simple. "Because you're not dead. Elena Grey isn't dead. She's been hiding, but she's still here." The footsteps passed by. In the distance, Daniel could hear cars starting, people calling to each other. Webb's people were pulling back, regrouping. Elena said they'd never stop hunting them. Daniel replied that then they'd stop hiding. Daniel pulled out his phone and opened the news app. The first story was already posted. Federal investigation launched into identity trafficking ring. Sarah had kept her promise. Elena read over his shoulder, her face cycling through disbelief, fear, and something that might have been relief. "It's over," she said. Daniel looked at her, acknowledging that for Webb, yes, it was over. For them, he didn't know. Elena Grey was still legally dead. Elena Grey was never real. She was caught between identities. When Elena asked what happened now, Daniel told her she had a choice. She could disappear again, start over somewhere else with a truly clean slate, or she could come back, face the legal mess, the financial problems, the complications of being resurrected. Elena was quiet for a long time. In the distance, they could hear sirens approaching the park. When Elena worried about Webb's people, Daniel assured her they were finished. Half would be arrested, the other half would be too busy running to worry about revenge. Elena asked about the debt, the original reason she'd had to disappear. Daniel said they'd figure it out together this time. Elena closed her eyes. When she opened them, They were wet with tears. She told Daniel she'd been Elena Grey for 3 weeks and hiding for 6 months before that. She was tired of being afraid of her own shadow. When Daniel asked what she wanted to do, Elena looked at the lights reflecting off the water, at the city beyond the park, at the life she'd abandoned and the life she'd been forced to live. "I want to go home," she said finally. "I want to be Elena Grey again, whatever that costs." The sirens were getting closer. Soon the park would be full of police and FBI agents and reporters. The story would explode across every news outlet in the city. Webb's empire would crumble, and the people trapped in it would finally have a chance to choose their own futures. Daniel pulled Elena closer as the first police cars entered the park, their headlights cutting through the darkness. He asked if she was sure, explaining that once they stepped out of these shadows, there was no going back, no more hiding. Elena watched the approaching lights. Police, FBI, media, the end of her secret life and the beginning of something uncertain but real. "I've been hiding for so long, I forgot what the light felt like," she said. They stepped out from behind the maintenance shed, hands raised as federal agents surrounded the park. In the distance, Daniel could see Webb being taken into custody, his expensive suit wrinkled, his confidence finally broken. Elena squeezed Daniel's hand as they walked toward the waiting agents. Each step took her further from Elena Grey and closer to Elena Grey, back to a name that belonged to her, back to a life that was hers to live. The investigation would take months. The legal complications would be endless. But Elena Grey was walking back into the light, breathing her own air, existing under her own name. She was alive. She was free. She was home. And she was no longer alone. The cemetery looked different in spring. Green grass covered the winter's scars, and flowers bloomed along the walkways. Daniel and Elena stood before the headstone that had once borne her name. Amy Chen, 1995 to 2023, finally at rest. The inscription was new, paid for with money from the Victims Fund established after Webb's arrest. Amy Chen had a real name on her grave now, and real flowers placed by people who had learned her story through the news coverage. Elena knelt and placed a single white rose beside the headstone. She spoke quietly to the stranger who had died so she could live, apologizing for never knowing her name when she'd been using her life. Daniel watched her grieve for someone she'd never met. The legal resurrection of Elena Grey had been complicated, involving federal prosecutors, victims' advocates, and more paperwork than either of them had imagined possible. But the process had been fast-tracked under a federal victim protection initiative designed specifically for cases like hers, people who had been exploited by identity trafficking rings. Her debt had been forgiven as part of the federal settlement. Webb's operation had been dismantled. 17 people had been arrested, and 43 victims had been identified and offered assistance in reclaiming their real identities. Some chose to return to their old lives. Others, like Robert Chen, decided to stay dead and start over legitimately elsewhere. The choice was finally theirs to make. Elena stood and brushed dirt from her knees. She was wearing the black flats Daniel had found in her apartment. Her favorite shoes, returned to her by the FBI evidence team, along with other personal belongings Webb's people had collected. Daniel asked if she was ready. Elena nodded. They walked hand in hand through the cemetery, past the graves of people who had died naturally, peacefully, surrounded by loved ones who would remember their real names. At the cemetery entrance, Elena paused and looked back. Daniel asked if she was having second thoughts. Elena said no, then searched for words. For 3 weeks, she'd been dead. For 6 months before that, she'd been dying a little every day. She'd forgotten what it felt like to exist without fear. When Daniel asked how it felt now, Elena smiled. It was the first truly unguarded smile he'd seen from her since before she'd disappeared. "It feels like breathing," she said. They drove through the city toward Elena's new apartment. Not new, actually. It was the same building where she'd lived before, but a different unit. The building manager had been surprisingly understanding when Elena Grey returned from the dead with a federal agent and a stack of legal documents. The apartment was small but bright, with windows that faced east toward the sunrise. Elena had furnished it simply: a couch, a table, a bed, and a bookshelf that was slowly filling up with the stories she'd missed while she was dead. Daniel helped her carry groceries up from the car, normal groceries for a normal life. Elena mentioned she'd gotten a job offer yesterday. When Daniel asked where, she told him it was with Victim Services, part of a federal advocacy program for whistleblowers and trauma survivors. They wanted someone who understood what it was like to lose your identity and find it again. Daniel said she'd be good at that. Elena agreed. They stood in Elena's kitchen, surrounded by the ordinary details of an extraordinary resurrection. Sunlight streamed through the windows, coffee brewed on the counter. The refrigerator hummed with the sound of a life being lived. Elena's phone buzzed. A text from Sarah, who had taken a position with the FBI's white-collar crime division, asking if the media attention was dying down yet. Elena typed back that it finally was, and she was ready to be boring again. Sarah replied that boring was underrated. Elena set down her phone and looked at Daniel, asking what happened now. Daniel said now they figured out what normal looked like. Elena admitted she wasn't sure she remembered. Daniel said neither did he, but they'd figure it out together. Outside the window, the city continued its daily rhythm. People went to work, came home, lived their lives under their real names. The news had moved on to other stories. Webb's trial was still months away, but the immediate crisis was over. Elena Grey was alive. She was free. She was home. And somewhere across the city, other people who had been trapped in Webb's system were making their own choices about who they wanted to be. Some would reclaim their old identities. Others would build new ones. Honestly, this time, the choice was theirs, just as it should be. Daniel poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Elena. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug and inhaled the steam. She thanked him. When Daniel asked for what, Elena said for not letting her stay dead. Daniel thought about the funeral, the umbrella, the long nights of searching for someone who was supposed to be gone forever. He thanked her for coming back to life. Elena smiled and raised her coffee cup in a mock toast. To breathing, Daniel agreed, raising his own cup. Outside, the sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the apartment where Elena Grey lived and breathed and existed under her own name. The name on her lease, her bank account, her driver's license, the name carved on her heart. Elena Grey was alive, and she was finally, truly free. Some people disappear by choice. Others vanish because someone needed their place in the world. If Elena's story left you questioning how far desperation can drive someone, hit that like button and let us know in the comments. What would you have done in her place? Subscribe to Crime Fictional because stories like these need to be told, and your support helps us uncover the next case that will keep you awake at night, thinking about the thin line between survival and sacrifice.